Hello, welcome to the first program in English. I would like to welcome Benoît Crucifix to the show. Hi.
Hi.
First of all, let me introduce you. I met Benoît in Leuven, Belgium, where we were both PhD students working on comics. Benoît has been in Portugal before and presented a talk on Olivier Schrauven. This was in March 2016 at the Biblioteca of Amadora in in Amadora in Portugal, where I used to work as a kind of a programmer, guest programmer. And we have had also a few other projects together, as for instance, an essay on Spirou's new adventures by Émile Bravo and Jan and Olivier Schwartz, entitled partially L'Archive Spirou, or the Spirou Archive, which has been published in the academic volume Les Métamorphoses de Spirou, which came out last year, 2019, edited by the Acme Group and published by the Presse Universitaire de Liège. Presently, Benoît Crucifix is preparing to defend his PhD dissertation, which he pursued at the universities of Liège and Leuven, right? Or is it Louvain-la-Neuve?
Louvain-la-Neuve, yeah.
Louvain-la-Neuve, so sorry. And he's about to start a postdoctoral project at the University of Ghent in the context of Mahin Ahmed's project on the history of children in European comics, which is funded by the European Research Council. In fact, also Mahin and Benoît were the editors of a volume published by Routledge.
Palgrave,
I'm sorry. Comics Memory.
Yes, archives and slides.
I'm sorry, I didn't take the note. I've participated also, but I don't with a paper, and I don't remember the title. So this talk that we will have will be around Ilan Manouach's latest books, and under a very specific perspective on archive comics. So Ilan Manouach is an artist born in Athens, Greece in 1980. He is also a musician and has played saxophone in a number of both collective and solo projects, from more or less conventional genres to highly experimental stuff, and he has toured the world for it. But we will be addressing here his comics output. He has been publishing for a long time. Actually, in the back, you can see a pile of some of his books, and we will focus on some of his more recent, let's call it for now, experimental comics. Ilan Manouach actually uses the idea or notion of concept comics, and both Benoît and I have addressed in several occasions some of his works within a category that we are working on that we call archive comics. So first of all, perhaps we should start with an explanation of what this category can mean, which is less a definition than a field of interest through which we can bring in several kinds of practices of comics. So would you like to present that notion, Benoît, please?
So yes, I like the idea of archive comics as a field of interest rather than a definition, a genre, or a kind of taxonomy or category that would apply or describe to certain kind of comics. I think the term bringing together in the same term archive comics does already imply that we're talking both about comics and archives, how comics can use archives, how comics can work as archives in themselves. And I think that's what we actually has been driving lots of our common discussions over the years. It has evolved quite a lot in the meantime. And I think the idea of archive comics is basically an attempt to describe a kind of archival impulse or a kind of turn to the past that has been more prominent over the last decades in comics history, quite a few decades actually. Just simply the concern with history is already something that's driving the graphic novel at large. But then it also, I think the idea of archive comics also raises more like broader concern about a fundamental matter of medium self-reflexivity, to put it maybe a bit in a jargon like, but by that I mean, like, how does a medium gather its own history? How does it think about its past? What uses are made out of whatever remains from comics history per se? And some of these questions that we addressed in the Spirou article. So how does a series that has kind of a long life does kind of look back on its history as a serial mechanism? In my dissertation, which is called Drawing from the Archives, which I've tried to also engage with some of these notions by looking at gestures of transmission that organize a sort of comics memory in the contemporary graphic novel. But I think that's also something that we have been talking a lot about, is that this is not, this kind of historical self-reflexivity is not something that's limited to the graphic novel per se, but something that's in fact can be seen as a fundamental part of any comics culture, which is also often organized around by fans, around kind of their archives or what they keep, what their memories are of a series, and which have turned publishers to also kind of cater to that market. So yeah, so I think that's some points that kind of bring together archiving comics. I think you could perhaps explain also a bit more the varieties of comics that this scope can encompass, which I think is also what you have brought to this still thought in progress, let's say, or work in progress.
Well, it is a thought in progress. And of course, we know that it's always dangerous to start thinking about all comics, because it is always possible to look at anything from a theoretical perspective that we are trying to construct. So it's easy for us to say, well, we can also talk about this and this. So we don't, the purpose here is not to create a dichotomy or an hierarchy between comics, because we see that this practice can be pursued in different manners. So we discussed this before. For instance, I was reminding of mainstream comics. For instance, even Marvel or DC comics, they have specific series that try to recreate their own history, their own canon in several manners. So on the one hand, you have the typical mechanism of the retcon. So the idea of revisiting a moment in the chronological history or biography of their characters and changing something, or adding up a new information that will change our perspective about the supposed biography, or even in presenting alternative histories such as Marvel's What If and DC's Elseworlds. So that is one practice, for instance, that I think it's fascinating to tell the truth. And then we have the Franco-Belgium, because usually most of the characters, historically speaking, most of the characters of Franco-Belgium comics belonged to one author, and now they are being reinvented by other authors like Blakey Mortimer, Lucky Luke, Spirou, Blueberry, etc. And it's interesting to see, I mean, there's a lot of very different approaches to this, but usually when these characters are in the hands of different authors, there's always a degree of difference that may be more interesting or more conventional. Now it's not the time to discuss that. Actually, our article about Spirou shows precisely two different practices with the same character, but we know that there's a lot of other practices. You have worked on an artist like Olivier Jossot. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. What is can you sum up the difference or the specificity of an artist such as Jossot?
Yeah, Jossot is someone who is doing actually a 5-part autobiographical series, which is very memoir-like. In the first, about his relationship to comics generally, how it tied in with his family history, and he uses it. The first volume is precisely something of reader's memoir, so where he accounts or tries to reconstruct his experience of reading as a child, and he communicates this experience of reading by copying, appropriating existing panels from a series of Franco-Belgian comics, Spirou, Lucky Luke, Tintin, and others, and then he recomposes them on the page, but redrawn in a style that's very close to the actual panels, and where he creates this kind of personal kind of memory of comics, which is interwoven with his own experience of reading, with a particular family history. But I think that's a case where it is more about quotation, intertextuality, imitation to a certain extent, than properly a kind of archival process. Although it is digging into the archives in a more kind of symbolic manner, it's perhaps less tied to, or to put it better, maybe it does play with the reader's memories of reading these comics. Most Franco-Belgian readers would share the same panels. That's kind of the experience, is being struck by the exact same panels that the author chose. And so it's really tapping into that collective memory, but perhaps less as a kind of material archive, even though it does rely on that, but more as a kind of reader's experience. I'm not sure that's very clear, but I think it does have some level of difference with the kind of practices that might take place either in these kind of continuities where we try to set forth a serial character or a serial product, even though it does rely on that experience of reading serial comics, of course. So it's not that these are like polarized practices, but
yeah, of course, because we could continue this exercise in quoting other practices. You mentioned appropriation, so of course we could talk about the moments within certain books where the style shifts to remember a certain moment in history or the history of comics, or talk about projects such as Bluch. Variation, where he redraws pages. So we could go on and on, but we have to come closer to Ilan's work. So you wrote a short essay on Manouach for an exhibition that was going to be presented, but because precisely of what is happening with the COVID-19 crisis, it was postponed, I think. So can you talk a little bit about that exhibition and your approach to Manouach's work, please?
Yes. So basically, the exhibition that was postponed was organized by Sébastien Connard for the Books Gallery here in Ghent. And he came up with the concept of post-comics and asked a couple of artists and scholars, researchers, or essayists to kind of making pairs and contributing something around the idea of post-comics. What are comics that do not really look like comics, but still kind of are seen as belonging to the sphere of activity, or that do kind of extend, prolong things typical for comics into another realm. It's a new notion that also has to raise debates, that tries to situate kind of the move of comics within contemporary art circles, which also participates in that process. And so I worked. Sébastien asked me to work with Ilan around his newer books, but also in a kind of survey-like piece on Ilan Manouach's trajectory, how he moved kind of away from comics in a way, but still kind of always using using comics, always engaging with these objects. And in the small text that I contributed, I did in this kind of trajectory style. I wanted to emphasize this kind of withdrawing from the activity of drawing itself. So Ilan started with works that were very marked by a personal style, so black and white, pencil. I can show an excerpt from La Mort du Cycliste, which had a very clear style of narration, very marked by a kind of a patte, we would say in French, kind of an individual kind of mark, and then more and more moving towards integrating digital technologies to the process by putting the individual expression at a distance, which marks it in this conceptual, which makes it this very conceptual approach to comics production.
Is this because one of the things that struck me the most was the use of the English word, and I really enjoyed it, the play that you do between drawing and not only undrawing but also withdrawing. Because I mean, in English there's a playfulness that is very interesting. Can you explain a little bit, or as Americans say, can you elaborate on that? On withdrawing. How do you think that word withdrawing in relation to this can operate as? What is the explanatory power of that notion in relation to Manouach's projects?
I like to play with the connotations of withdrawing, undrawing, because it does keep. In a way, it keeps drawing as part of the verb, so it does not mean that he's no longer drawing anymore. He still works with drawings, but it does highlight what does he do with these drawings, which is no longer the fact of tracing, which you could have in practices of redrawing, for instance, just as we talked about Jossor, but also all of these kind of archive comics will often proceed to redrawing, because it also by making it one's own, or like appropriating characters using one's own graphic mark, one is also less prone to breach copyright licenses. It makes it already more of a parody exercise, which is more tolerated by copyright law. While what Manouach does, and maybe other conceptual comics artists do, is that they, in the sense of withdrawing or undrawing, they move drawing along. So it's more of also a digital practice of displacing images, copying them, but not using the human, not using not retracing them in a way. And yes, but in doing so, they still keep doing so does highlight a certain part of the drawing that is being withdrawn or undrawn. So there is an intervention in the drawing that exists.
I think that one of the things that we could go through is a very short summary or explanation of Ilan Manouach's books, the ones that we want to bring to the fore in this discussion, because on the one hand, some of the books are not easy to find or are impossible to find, actually. I mean, depends on where you are, but I think that there's some difficulty inherent to check out most of these publications. And also, on the other hand, we cannot forget that for some time, some of the projects were secret in a way. So the name of the author or the supervisor of these projects, Ilan Manouach, was not public. So the books that we are discussing here is, first of all, the 2012 book Cats, in which Ilan picked up Art Spiegelman's mouse and he replaced every single character's head by the drawing of a cat head. Here, we should say that the purpose was not exactly to create a pirate edition in the sense that people would be fooled into thinking, oh, is this a new book? Because it's very clear that intervention. The other book, I think it's 2013, was Noir, which is physically, it's exactly the same as Schtroumpfs, or in English, a Smurfs album. But the thing is, he substituted all the colors. So traditionally, this is printed in 4-color, and he substituted all the colors only with cyan. So all the book looks like a huge blue spot, and it makes difficult some of the readings. And this plays upon the main story, because this volume has 3 stories. This plays upon the main story, which is the Schtroumpfs Noirs, or the Black Smurfs. I think that the English edition, they changed the title and the color. It was the purple Smurfs, yeah, right? So, but in the original, it was the Black Smurfs. So there's a play here, of course, about the issue of a potential racist reading of Peyo. Then the other project is Ricky Fermier from 2015, which is based on a very famous European series called Petsy. And in this project, what he did was he eliminated all the characters except for the pelican, Ricky. And so it becomes a very weird, melancholic story where this isolated, alone character is roaming around the village and talking to himself in a way. Of course, we're laughing, so there's a degree of humor here, but at the same time, there's a lot of other issues and questions that arise out of this. Another project is Tintin Ake Congo, which is basically an edition of Tintin in Congo, but in Lingala, which is one of the main languages in Congo, the native languages. I'm not sure if I can use this term. It's just this. So Tintin usually boasts that it's the most translated series in the world, and all the languages. There's even in Esperanto or in other Klingon, probably. But then it has never been translated into the main language of the country which it's supposed to take place. So that also brings a lot of other issues that we will go into in a moment. Then we have the Abrégé de bande dessinée franco-belge from 2018, which is a very complicated book because it's a kind of a free-fall collage of onomatopoeia words, faces, cars, characters. It's almost like a kind of a visual recomposition that makes no visible sense. So it's almost like an abstract construction with figures. Then we also have Cascão. This probably, I think you mentioned that you don't have. I will show other images, of course, but this is a very typical Brazilian magazine, which is called in Brazil GB. So it's a cheap magazine, and this is from a character, very famous character. This is also very known in Portugal. Cascão is a little boy that belongs to a group of very famous characters, which is called the Turma da Mônica. And basically, Cascão is a boy that hates water. He doesn't like to take baths, and he hates water. So most of the stories, it's always someone trying to pour water on him or clean him or throw water. And there's always something that makes him escape. And basically what this is one of these magazines was put into a washing machine, and of course it was cleaned, so it became ruined in a way. And then Ilan made copies out of that washed copy.
I thought he had applied bleach to it, no?
Oh, is it bleach?
I can't remember.
Maybe.
Because
so
the washing machine might have destroyed completely the comic.
Okay. So I'm probably wrong. Your description is probably correct. I'm sorry.
Nope.
Because I actually someone passed to me and I didn't have the opportunity to talk to Ilan about this. So finally we have two more. It's the La Ballade de Marseille. I think you have that copy as well. I actually didn't ask exactly what happened here, but it's basically the whole book is redrawn. All the book has been redrawn by an artist Do you have any specific information? Because I don't remember where the artist is from. I mean, I'm going to show my ignorance, but I think that it's a local, an artist from the place where the action is of the book itself, right?
It might be. I think it's. I would say Malaysia, but I'm not completely sure.
But it's basically the book is completely redrawn, relettered. It's like a copy, what I call a bootleg version of the book, redrawn by someone else. And finally, the last project is the Cubical Island, which is the second, I believe, project that Ilan did with micro workers. So in the sense of making a call through several internet platforms of people contributing to the construction of this project. And it's basically, it's a huge book that collects hundreds of the very typical cliche cartoon of the little island with a palm tree and a shipwreck survivor in the middle with some humor purpose. And then, so it's a collection of those images. Sometimes they even repeat within the book. And then people proposed or submitted new captions. Some of the captions are really descriptive. Some others are attempts at doing humor. Some others are almost essayistic in nature. And some others are just machine lingo. So it's like, it's a machine that created the things.
There's one book that you forgot to mention, and which I like a lot, is the Blanco. Which is the completely version, and which is a good illustration of that aspect, since it's what I like about it is that it uses this kind of 48 cc 48 page carton et couleur, which is the ultimate standard, let's say, of Franco-Belgian publishing industry, but which precisely doesn't need a Blanco, because a Blanco is this book normally made for books that have normal shapes, so that the printer can realize, is it holding up? Are the pages folding correctly? Because it's not a book that we used to produce. But of course, you don't need that, because all the 48 cc, you know how it works. You don't need to do a Blanco to test the printing in a way. So he does make this kind of invisible object. And what I found most interesting in Blanco is the way that then the object circulates. If you go on the online retailing websites, you do see a blank cover featured. Also, it's called the booksellers in bookshops would display the book next to Scott McCloud's Invisible Art, for instance. So creating kind of jokes, and in a way, it's the book becomes meaningful through its sheer circulation. So it's not only the object in itself is sometimes might look a bit like this arty-farty thing, or let's do something wide, but actually becomes interesting in the way that people make use of it. And in this sense, it's not like a kind of art pretension, but more of a generative project, or kind of a productive thing to do, I found.
So we will not have the opportunity here to talk about each of the books. And I mean, I have written about some of these books in the past. Benoît has done the same thing and will do in the future. So basically, we will continue our talk almost about the whole thing, even though these are very different projects and they elicit different things. So I talked a lot. So I want to read out loud one quote from the text that you've written that I really enjoyed, and I would like you to go back to this. So your quote is this, you wrote, "His case," Ilan's, "precisely tends to undercut the auteur model of the graphic novel. If a cartoonist's path is often traced as a particular relationship to graphic style, Manouach's line of work is perhaps better described as a continuous process of withdrawing or undrawing, disengaging himself from the stylistic singularity that usually shapes the making and reading of graphic narratives." So as I said, there are practices that it's exactly to quote styles of other people, like Tom Scioli that draws like Kirby. So he's trying to elicit a memory of Kirby. But here we are in front of very different projects. Actually, so I want to introduce, but I want to say another thing. One of the things that is very interesting with these books is that I've been writing comics criticism for some time. I'm not saying that my comics criticism practice is the best that I can do, or that it's always in a good level, let's say. But there's typically when you write, when you have some experience, it's typical, it's unavoidable. It's not good, but it's unavoidable that we start to have the same instruments that we use. So it's already, we know what we have to do in order to criticize a book. We have to check the narrative, page composition, the use of color, etc. But with Manouach's books, it's almost like I'm hitting a wall, and I don't even know how to start talking about these books as comics. But that's very, very interesting. So going back to your quote, what do you think are the limits of talking about these books as comics?
No, it's good. There's a lot to unpack, of course, but I like what you described about Ilan's book, kind of confronting reviewers with whatever tricks that we're used to when we write about comics. And in another sense, I think they also call for critics. So they're as many conceptual objects, they don't go without the critical commentary that kind of explicitates their process or how they were made, what's the concepts behind it, or that can organize it. So in a way, it has this that I find sometimes ambivalent kind of relationship where not only Ilan is also a very good theoretician, a very good writer, and very elaborate in explicitating his works. So he already give some kind of impulse to criticism or how we can talk about these books. But it also kind of demands some critics to kind of relay what they might mean, even though it doesn't mean that it pins down like what you can do with it or so. And that leads me back to actually the quote that you just mentioned from my text, and which is actually also, it was basically just me riffing off your article about Noir, which was already kind of advancing that idea of Manouach's kind of putting expression into machines by kind of letting the printer work, or like and just changing one parameter in the printing process, and that parameter being changed being in itself significant in the intervention, which is, I think, is the very powerful thing that he does in kind of disengaging the authorist focus, but in a way that, like, the more radical he has grown in this approach, the more he has existed as a public author, let's say, which is something that's also an ambivalence in, for instance, Kenneth Goldsmith, the uncreative poet who kind of manipulates language, who also does a lot of appropriation work, is that he, conceptual artists of that kind, advance authorless production, but themselves kind of exist as authorial figures, and they, in order to also sustain this approach, they do also need to do that, because that's how things work in the media industry, let's say. So that's something. If we compare it to Cats, for instance, which was done indeed under the radar, Ilan not appearing as an author, well, he being more on the background, also Xavier Leventhal taking a lot of the time taking the role of the spokesperson for these books, was certainly the case for Cats, for Tintin Congo, for Noir, and for Ricky. And by contrast, the Cubical Island, for instance, is signed, authored by Manouach. La Balade de la Mer Salée is not signed, but it's also featured on Ilan Manouach's website. So he has asserted more clearly the authorship of this project, but an authorship that is a conceptual authorship. And this kind of has allowed him to be more radical in the uncreativity of the production process, I think.
So at this point, I would like to introduce a quote by Walter Benjamin from his most famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, where he says this, quote, "The instant the criterion of authenticity ceases to be applicable to artistic production, the total function of art is reversed. Instead of being based on ritual, it begins to be based on another practice, politics." So actually, we've been talking about how, some of these works use a lot of the specific materialities of comics, either the format, the printing processes, or the strategies of creating narrative, style, etc. So, and the thing is, they are not, as you said, on the one hand, some people will think, oh, this is like a one-trick pony, so it's so funny, the book has bleach, and okay, that's it. But the thing is, although they do have that kind of humor, trick, ready-made nature, exactly as good works of art, they force us to think about the implications of all of those aspects, the politics of production, distribution, etc. What do you think, or how do you think that these projects work in that sense?
It's a good question. I like the idea of the humor and the reflexivity, or the capacity to kind of think about it is not something that's in itself kind of contradictory. So you can have the one pony trick aspect. You can have the thing that's it's also funny. So I think there's the book. One other book that we didn't talk about is the Lapino that's been flattened. You know that one?
Oh no, I don't. That's the first time I'm seeing that.
It's maybe a more controversial one in a way. So it's when l'association started to do again 48cc, so was going to produce some Lapino in 48cc format. The cinquième couche and Ilan, but also Xavier decided to do a kind of homage to Manu as a 33 vinyl-sized album of
Yes.
Lapino, which is just the things but completely flattened. And it's the same, and it was released at the same time as the Lapino. So sometimes it gets in. Some people will order it by accident. You can check Amazon reviews, being like, "What the hell? This thing is completely flattened." And so, in a way, that's a bad joke. In a way, that's like it's kind of a nasty joke played on Trondheim, but it's also funny. It has this, and it's the same for, I think, the Petsies it's a funny, also melancholic album. So I think this capacity to bring together funniness and reflexivity is in itself something that you also find in the most commercially thriving comics of the mad satire parody. It always has this kind of humor dimension, but I think the more of the political intervention, let's say, that Ilan is striving for, is in interrogating the kind of the globalization of comics production, trying to highlight these processes. So lots of the work in Cubical Island can be described as a kind of work lore. This kind of there's been lots of talk about people doing jokes at work, printing, like printing your butt cheeks on the photocopiers or that kind of stuff. And so he's trying with the so let me start again. The kind of work lore, like the cartoons that would be used in work lore, he's trying to move that into the labor context of 21st century digital labor, basically, which is why it's kind of called the Cubical Island. Like it questions the idea of the cubicle, which I think it's even more telling in the context of COVID, since everybody's room is becoming like a cubicle of one's own in a way. And he's playing with this idea of what is digital labor, what's kind of what's also the tragedy of people having to come up with ways of earning a living in different ways, and precisely those bots that kind of like those lines that sorry, I'm not being very clear, but those lines that you highlight in the Cubical Island, where it's mostly machine filling in automatically the captions to the cartoons. It's often kind of workers trying to gain more time and devising bots that will fill in automatically kind of a micro work like demands or micro tasks, performing very precise tasks. And so that leads to all kinds of errors that Ilan was first wanting to sort out of the books, thinking that's not really working. But then he, like, seeing how many there was, he also thought that's actually generative of it's also funny in a way, and it's also kind of generative of what this is all about. So it has this kind of this reflection about the politics of microworking, of digital labor, which is in itself also a question, because Ilan has to participate in that economy by kind of giving tasks to microworkers, maybe appropriating in a way the labor that's being produced, and so it does raise questions. But I think that's what I described in the small article, is this trying to make kind of an echo chamber. So throwing things like it's a grain, like throwing things into the machine that are not supposed to go into the machine, and then looking at what it's going to do to it, or what is going to kind of resonate through the process of the assembly.
I think that you are very close to a very important issue that I'm not sure if I am equipped or prepared to discuss, this aspect of labor, but we are close to that. And as we've discussed beforehand, before this talk, I mentioned a distinction that Marielle Vigermans, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, she makes a distinction or a dichotomy between memory and archive, in which memory is considered active in circulation, while the latter is, and I quote, preserved in an inert state. So we are discussing this as one of the practice of what we are calling archive comics, but at this moment I would like to bring it closer to memory and away from archive. So, I mean, if we had the opportunity at the time, we could contrast Ilan's practice with artists such as Jochen Gerner, Simon Greenan, Pascal Mattei, which all of them in very different ways have also done performative practices of archive comics. But there are differences between them, of course. And for instance, while Jochen Gerner seems to create a database of sorts with his works, while Manouach seems interested in short-circuiting the retrievability of the archivable. This is not a question.
No, it makes sense. I think also...
sorry. For instance, this is neither here or there, but I mean, I'm a big fan of Obapo comics. I think they're funny. There's a lot of great exercises, and actually, as a teacher of comics, if I have the opportunity, I introduced my students to a lot of exercises of Obapo. However, at the end of the day, Obapo is really like an exercice de salon. So it's it worked. Where Manouach, these books are not creating something that they're not doing things that will make people, I want to do the same thing because it's done. It's not a stimulus to do something, but it's more stimulating intellectually and conceptually, because they're really they're bringing. It's like they're asking a question and we can answer it. It's like a Zen practice. So I really think that it comes to a limit, but that's a good thing, I think, to come to a limit of, usually people that, one of the things that I really don't like when discussing comics, it's when people talk about a new book and say, oh, this book really brought comics to its true potential. I mean, it has been 150 years of incredible different practices. So stop already with the potential. It's done. Just check the things that have been done. And I actually think that these books are not showing a potential. They're showing this is a limit. But that's a good thing because the limit forces us to recreate exactly the frontiers of comics practices.
That's a great way of putting it. It's like showing us the wall that's where comics are hitting. And in a way, it's also, I think, a response to the sheer abundance of things that have already been done. So it's not an attempt to make yet one more new thing, but to work with the leftovers. And in this sense, it's kind of like, Pascal Maté since 978. It's also the same publisher, not surprisingly, which kind of reworks all the comics magazines, like the publicity material that Pascal was receiving at the bookstore that he was working, and it's kind of this confrontation with all the trash that the comics industry is producing, raised for him as an artist who does, as a cartoonist who does very different work, generally more kind of traditional, let's say, alternative comics, to engage with the trash of whatever is left over of this mainstream comics industry. And I think that in this sense, Manouach and Maté are more comparable, and it's this idea of how can we reframe things that have already been done? How can we kind of reuse materials from the past, which is at the center of any kind of archive comics, and which is not, as in a way, the more of the serial continuity comics would be, which is, let's take this old serial that's kind of not working very well and try to refresh it to get new readers, to maybe get a new license going, and so on.
I mean, don't get me wrong, because I mean, you can have the 1,000th, millionth story of Batman, and I will probably read it with a lot of pleasure. I do read mainstream comics, and I do enjoy the so-called literary graphic novels. But the thing is, I mean, during a long time, there were things that were, when they started to appear, people say, oh, this is not exactly comics because it's not funny, for instance. And then people accepted, so it changed completely the idea, even the word graphic novel. Some people would probably say, I read graphic novels, I don't read comics, for instance. But the thing is, it's almost like an obligation. So comics now have to deal with very serious subjects in a very serious manner. And it's almost like it's just another imposition, and you do what you want. And one of the other things that I really hate in both Portuguese and French, our respective languages, people use a lot the expression ninth art, right? The ninth art. And actually, I never like that expression, not only because it presents an idea of an hierarchy, either historical or of values, but also because it's very rich to say, oh, I love the ninth art, but then when you have practices that are actually doing what art does, that's not comics. So it's like the ninth art has to, the great masters of the ninth art has to be the guy that draws women really well, or a story that is very intriguing and surprising. And then when we have practices like this, you have a huge group of people that would probably put it aside and say, well, that's not exactly comics, it's something else. But I actually think that's why these questions brought by these books are really interesting, because they are really forcing us. What art does is forcing us to look at things in an incredibly different way, rethink categories. So it's interesting. That's why I was referring to limits. Even if I can't explain it in a more elegant and eloquent way, that's what I feel.
Yeah, no, I see what you meant, but I like this idea of kind of forcing us towards highlighting the limitations or highlighting the limits rather than highlighting kind of an endless potential of thing. And of course, it's also its kind of own potential of in itself. Well, you just forget about what I just said.
No. It's good. No, I mean,
no, what they. Yeah.
I mean, some people will probably say, "Oh, you cannot explain it because you have nothing to say," which is probably true. But I really feel that there's something here that should be considered in a more profound fashion. But at least at this point, I really think that I reached a limit also of the discourse about comics, and I think that that's in itself a good point of departure. Okay, so I would like to ask you a last question, which is, of course, a provocation. But Ilan is using Tinta, Peyo, Spiegelman, Pratt, Trondheim, and the Franco-Belgium corpus as a whole. Do you think that in any way is still respecting or constructing towards a certain canonicity of comics?
That's a really good question. I think it's this kind of practice.
Ilan will kill us when he hears about this, of course.
Don't scare me. No, but I think I don't think so, but I think like this kind of practice worked better with things that people know. Mm-hmm. So if you take, this obscure comic that nobody knows and then you bleach it or whatever, it's like, people will be like, what's this thing? It's like but it's the basic of détournement already. Like the situationists were saying is like, you have to recognize, like you have to change it just enough so that people recognize it, but recognize that's also something's going wrong. So I think that's the reason why he does uses but at another level, the Cubical Island kind of already gestures towards something that's different. Kind of, well, it takes the New Yorker cartoons, which have their own degree kind of respectability, but which does function outside of a kind of a canonical economy in a certain way. So I think it's kind of, let's say, a bit in between. And also, the abrégé de la bande dessinée franco-belge does kind of try to investigate more the banal 48s, like the normal Franco-Belgian comics, because he randomly bought super cheap copies of 48 albums that he then kind of contracted into one album to try to make this kind of vocabulary of Franco-Belgian comics. And in this sense, it does work much better as trying to understand the standard rather than building on a canonical author or work. And in any case, so no, that would be it.
Well, I am quite certain that we could continue, of course, because there's a lot of things here. If we started comparing, for instance, the abrégé, it was, and you said about the recognizability of the point of departure of the comics of departure, and I was reminded of Gerner's project with a small format, the petit format, which is something that I was not familiar with because those are Franco. Yeah, exactly. I was not familiar with that format, but as soon as you understand the rule, let's say, you understand. So we could continue that. But I think that we've had a good conversation around this thing, and I hope it's enjoyable also for the audience, and maybe we can continue this in some other form. So thank you, Benoît, for being with us.
Thank you, Benoît. It felt like when we were in Leuven having coffees.
Yeah, and then we would have to look at the clock and I have to go, and
Yeah.
then we wouldn't. So thank you very much, and I hope that people enjoyed this talk. I'm not certain if so for people that only speak English, I'm not sure if I'm going to do more of these talks in English, but I will continue them in Portuguese in my channel. So thank you very much, and see you soon, I hope. After this, I mean, I hope that soon means months and not years, but let's at least we have this. Okay, thank you, and see you soon.
Thank you.